Morning, Dan and Amy. And so on this Paris Accord, interesting perspective. Not necessarily mine, but an interesting perspective from Bjorn Lomborg, who is a academic in Denmark. He runs a outlet or enterprise called the Copenhagen Consensus Center. He did a podcast with Nick Gillespie over at reason.com. It's worth checking out. It's only about 20 minutes. Very good. And he is someone who is concerned about climate change, believes it poses a real threat, believes man is primarily responsible for it. So with that backdrop, listen to his take on the Paris Accord that Trump pulled out of last week.
Paris Climate Accord. Tell us why it's a good thing that the United States has decided to rethink its participation.
So fundamentally, the two things you need to know about the Paris Agreement is, one, it is not going to do very much to tackle climate. So if you look at the UN's own estimate, if everyone had delivered everything they had promised, including Trump and the US, by 2030, the Paris Agreement would have delivered less than 1% of what it's promising. So very, very tiny impact on climate.
So it leaves 99% of the problem it says it's going to solve in place.
So the second thing is it's incredibly costly. It's probably the most costly treaty ever to be signed in history. So if you look at what is the likely cost across the main areas where we have good estimates, it indicates that it's probably around $1 trillion in cost if you do it in the most effective way. That means with carbon taxes in all the relevant regions. And if you don't, which is typically the way you do climate policy, it could easily be $2 trillion. So $1 to $2 trillion a year for the rest of the century, mostly in lost GDP growth. And the net benefit at the end of the century, even if you're very optimistic, will to have been reduced the temperature by about 0.3 degrees Fahrenheit. So spend $100 trillion to achieve virtually no climate benefit. That's a bad deal.
It's
you think?
It's nice to get some honesty from a left-leaning academic. We just got some from Bjorn Lomborg. For more on this topic, we're pleased to be joined by Joe Bast. He's the president and CEO of the Heartland Institute, heartland.org. It's a think tank located here in suburban Chicago. It's been around for 3 decades, and they've really been one of the lead organizations in the world in debunking some of the climate hysteria surrounding climate change and the associated policies that have been promoted by the big government left and, frankly, even some that call themselves Republicans, but turned out to be part of the big government crowd as well on this topic. Joe, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Hey, good morning, Dan. Thank you for having me on.
So your reaction, not just to Trump pulling out of the Paris Accord, but in terms of how this has turned the debate on this issue?
I think it's having a tremendous impact. And to get an idea of why it would, think about the impact that Barack Obama has had on this debate for the last 8 years. It was incredibly hard for realists in this debate, realists like Bjorn Lomborg, who you were quoting, to get any hearing at all. When the President of the United States himself is demonizing groups like the Heartland Institute and dismissing any research that questions basically the Sierra Club and the Earth First kind of crowd on global warming, the American public just end up with one side of the debate and no reason to question it. So along comes President Trump, and he has legitimized arguments that we have been making now for going on 20 years. Withdrawing from the Paris Accord was an outstanding step. I think he hit the ball out of the park. I mean, it really sets a new marker for what this debate is going to look like going forward.
So people are getting upset over an agreement that would basically do nothing to solve climate change. But the Obama administration ended up shipping $1 billion in taxpayer dollars to this fund without authorization from Congress. Do you have any idea who received that money, or did it go to a corrupt government?
Well, you can pretty much bank on that. But no, I don't know how that money has actually been distributed. But you're absolutely right. The United States gave $1 billion Very few other countries are making contributions to that fund. They expect it to reach $100 billion a year by 2020. That's only 3 years from now. It's just ludicrous on its face that the United States would be giving probably tens of billions of dollars every year to a fund administered by the United Nations, the most corrupt organization in the world, to give to dictators of third world countries. Just crazy.
Now, I've been citing some of your work over the last several days as we've been talking about this issue again, now that the debate's not over anymore like it was prior. But I want you to elucidate some of the work that you guys have done, some of the talking points that are used by the left repeatedly, particularly about the scientific consensus. And 97% of scientists agree that climate change is real and man is primarily responsible.
Well, thanks for the question. Yeah, we've been working on this for a long time. Actually, since 1993 was the first book that the Heartland Institute published that covered climate change. And we've assembled scientists from all around the world to try to give voice to the other side of the debate. And what we've learned is that most scientists, not some small fringe, not 10%, but most scientists do not believe that there is a large human impact on climate. They especially don't believe that we can forecast this going forward. So when they look at the human impact, they say, well, compared to natural variability, yes, there is a human impact, and sure, climate changes all the time, but the human impact is so small that it's probably below our level of detection, and it's certainly below natural variability. Things involving ocean currents, for example, and solar cycles have been shown to have a much bigger impact than human-made carbon dioxide. And then finally, trying to forecast this into the future, the only way that we can do that is with computer models. And very few scientists have confidence that these computer models are doing anything close to producing scientific predictions. Essentially, it's garbage in, garbage out. We don't know what future climate conditions will be. It's futile to try to forecast them.
Well, people are wondering, too, how can you reduce your own carbon footprint? Without
you can
eliminating yourself from the earth.
You can stop breathing.
That's one way to do it.
Start. That's one way to do it because we all exhale carbon dioxide. Your carbon footprint is supposed to be the amount of carbon dioxide that your activities produce and emit. And driving cars, especially big cars, long distances, produce a lot of carbon dioxide. Flying airplanes, owning mansions, produces a lot of carbon dioxide. So, but at the end of the day, what you're saying is abandon modernity, abandon the new technologies that have made it possible for your kid to go to college and to come back and visit you more often. Abandon the job that takes more than 20 minutes or 30 minutes to drive to because you should be working close to where you live. It says live in an apartment building. Don't live in a single-family home because your carbon footprint is too big if you live in your own house with your own backyard and your own driveway. And take a bus or a train, even though it's less convenient than owning a car or a truck. All of these things are essentially a war against all the modern progress that's been made in the last 30, 40 years. And that's not a coincidence because that's what the left's agenda has been for the last 30 or 40 years. It's what they were calling for before global warming ever became an issue, and it's what they're going to be calling for after global warming is no longer talked about.
But
as President Trump said, it's not about global warming. This treaty was never about the science. It was about redistributing income, increasing government control over industry, and handicapping U.S. manufacturers. That's what it's been about.
Right, but it's abandoned modernity for thee, not for me, when it comes to the left, of course. And I just wanted a little historical perspective because it seems to me what you're saying is what I wrote this week in my little 60-second vignette, which is you're not a threat to the planet's existence, only the left's dominion over the planet. And we've seen this with Rachel Carson, going back 50-plus years with Rachel Carson and DDT and pesticides, and then it was global cooling in the 70s, and then it was global warming, and then it's climate change. I forgot the population bomb that was a dud. So it's one apocalyptic doom and gloom scenario that the left promulgates, until that one's debunked, and then they go on to the next one, because at base, it's always the effort to exert control over others.
That's exactly right. And they're never held to account for their mistaken forecasts. So we just move from one crisis to another. It's often even the same guys. The same guys who are claiming that there's a global warming crisis were the guys who were saying there was a pesticide crisis 20 years ago. So, and the reason they get away with it is the liberal media fails to do its job of holding these guys accountable for their false predictions and start, putting them on the do not quote list because these guys have been discredited. So the media fails to do its job. The universities end up getting just saturated with these left-wing advocates, even now science departments. I mean, there are surveys of physics departments and other science departments that show that vast majority of these guys self-identify as liberal or far left. What are these guys doing as physicists when they're hardcore left-wingers? When they speak out on a public policy issue, chances are they're advocating an agenda and not talking about the science.
He is Joe Bast, President and CEO of the Heartland Institute, heartland.org. Joe, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate it.
Oh, you bet. Thank you.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.